Welcome back to Race and Rights. Today we're diving into a topic that's heavy but necessary: the Eighth Amendment and the death penalty. Specifically, how capital punishment in the U.S. has disproportionately impacted Black Americans. Now, if you've been following along, you already know that the Constitution is full of lofty ideals about justice and fairness, but the way those ideals play out is a totally different story. So let's start with the basics. The Eighth Amendment, part of the Bill of Rights, says the government can't impose cruel and unusual punishment. Now, what actually counts as cruel and unusual changes over time. What was acceptable in 1791 isn't necessarily acceptable today. That's where the courts come in. The Supreme Court has spent decades trying to figure out whether the death penalty fits into this category. And I'm going to tell you guys, this has been a messy debate. Let's break down three major cases that shaped this issue. Furman v. Georgia, decided in 1972. William Henry Furman, a Black man, was convicted of murder and sentenced to death after a burglary went wrong. But here's the thing. His trial was incredibly fast, and his sentence seemed more about chance than a fair legal process. He wasn't alone. People of color, particularly Black men, were disproportionately receiving death sentences, often for similar crimes where white defendants got life instead. The Supreme Court basically said, hold up. The way y'all are handing out death sentences is all over the place. It was arbitrary, inconsistent, and racially biased, so they struck it down. Gregg v. Georgia, decided in 1976. Just 4 years later, the court was like, never mind, y'all. If states fix their sentencing guidelines, they can bring it back. So they did. After the Furman decision, states rewrote their death penalty laws to try and make sentencing more consistent. Enter Troy Leon Gregg, a white man convicted of robbery and murder in Georgia. He was sentenced to death under these new sentencing guidelines, which were supposed to remove arbitrary decision-making. The Supreme Court ruled in a 7-2 decision that the death penalty wasn't unconstitutional as long as the states had clear, structured guidelines to prevent bias. This officially reinstated the death penalty and set the stage for executions to resume under these improved procedures. McCleskey v. Kemp, decided in 1987, is the one that really shows how deep racial bias runs. Warren McCleskey, a Black man, was convicted of killing a white police officer during a robbery in Georgia. His legal team presented a groundbreaking study showing that Black defendants, especially those who killed white victims, were far more likely to receive the death penalty. The study, known as the Baldus study, found that in Georgia, a Black person convicted of killing a white victim was over 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death than a white person convicted of killing a Black victim. The Supreme Court acknowledged the numbers but still ruled against him, saying general statistics weren't enough to prove discrimination in a specific case. Now y'all, let that sink in. The system was literally producing racist outcomes, but because he couldn't prove intentional bias in his particular case, the death sentence stood. Each of these cases shaped how the death penalty is applied and whether racial disparities in sentencing could be legally challenged. The bottom line, the Supreme Court has repeatedly acknowledged racial bias in capital punishment, but it has also made it nearly impossible to challenge it successfully in court. This isn't just about old cases. The numbers still tell the same story today. Black people make up about 13% of the U.S. population, but over 40% of death row inmates. A Black defendant who kills a white victim is far more likely to get the death penalty than a white defendant who kills a Black victim. And let's not forget, wrongful convictions are a real thing. Since 1973, over 195 people on death row have been exonerated, and guess what? The majority of them were Black. This isn't a coincidence, it's a pattern rooted in the history of racial violence in America, from lynchings to Jim Crow era legal executions to today's capital punishment system. So here's the big question. Does the death penalty as it exists today actually reflect evolving standards of decency like the Supreme Court claims it should? Some argue that it should be abolished completely, because how can you have a just system with this level of racial bias? Others believe that if we just fix the sentencing process, the death penalty can be applied fairly. But history tells us that fixing things hasn't exactly worked. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think the death penalty, as it applies today, violates the Eighth Amendment? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this with a friend, and let's keep this conversation going. I'll see you next week.